but they would have understood it. And so, but when you look at any translation, in most cases, they'll break it up into several senses. They'll stick verbs in there. They'll make participles into main verbs. Why? In order for it to make sense to us in English. So that's where we get into this issue of the theory of translation. How do you take what was originally in the Greek, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and put it in such a way that it makes sense in the receptor mind, so that people will actually understand the text? There are basically three theories of translation. And so you find different versions that will address this, and they come from different perspectives. The first is the literal translation. There are technically no absolutely 100% literal translations. Even the King James, which many people believe to be a very literal translation, is not entirely literal. Because you will find places in the King James, and even in the New King James, where you will find words in italics. When you find those words in italics in those two translations, that means they have added that word to the English text in order for it to make sense. And so even the literalness of the King James has had to add words in English to make it make sense. But the theory behind literal translation is you want to keep as close as possible to the original language. So if it's a participle in the original language, you try to put it in a participle in English. If you have a Greek word, you try to find an English equivalent word, right? And so you try to keep as close as possible to the exact words, the exact phrasing, yet it still has to make sense, right? And so sometimes you have these prepositions or a verb or something like that that will be added. There.
For example, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, even though that was not translated, would that be considered something close to literal? Given this age?
Yeah, well, not so much literal, because a lot of those would have been translations, or some cases paraphrases. But the manuscripts were just copies of Hebrew manuscripts, and so the manuscripts would just have been copies of them. And so we're talking about moving from original language into like an English, or like the Septuagint would be a translation, right? Moving from the Hebrew into the Greek, right? So they're both the Old Testaments, just one in the original is Hebrew, and then the Septuagint was the Greek translation of those scriptures. Now, one of the things with the literal translation with respect to historical distance is you keep that historical distance. Right? You don't try to put any sort of equivalent, right? And so the weights that were used, right? You keep the weights, the money, right? You don't try to put it in dollars or in yen or in euros or anything like that. If you're doing a literal translation, you are putting it literally. And so King James would be an example, New King James, even the New American Standard to some extent would be examples of literal translations. On the other end of the continuum would be the free translation. The free translation, those engaging in developing free translation would be interested in trying to express the ideas of the text without necessarily being tied down to the words of the original. Often these types of books are called paraphrases rather than translations because they're not necessarily trying to translate the words. And so the Message would be an example of this. The New Living Translation would be an example of this, though not as extreme as the Message. The Living Bible, which was kind of the predecessor to the New Living Translation. With respect to the historical distance, right, the paraphrase is going to try and eliminate as much historical distance as possible. And so putting weights in maybe pounds or tons or something like that, or putting money in dollars and cents to try and help people understand, all right, I don't know how much a denarius was. I don't know what a cubit is, but I do know feet and I do know dollars. Right? And so it's about trying to make it make sense in the receptor without being held to the exact words. In between the two is what's known as the dynamic equivalent. Essentially, the idea behind the dynamic equivalent is that it's an attempt to translate words, idioms, grammatical constructions of the original into precise equivalents in the receptor mode. Right? And so you're not as literal as the literal translation, right? Because some of those literal translations, after you get some distance away from them, they can sound very wooden, right? And they can be difficult to understand. But the dynamic equivalent tries to keep some literalness, but not be as bound to the exact word. And so there's that equivalent. On historical and factual matters, the dynamic equivalent keeps the historical distance, but might update issues related to language, grammar, style. So this would be something like the New International, the Revised Standard, New Revised Standard, and even to some extent, the ESV would kind of be somewhere between literal and dynamic equivalent. Now, certainly, of course, there's the challenge of going too far with this, either not going far enough or going too far. I mean, in the Living Bible, it talks about the Word being a flashlight. Your Word is a flashlight to my feet, from Psalm 119, 105. Okay, well, kind of, but doesn't it lose something when you say it like that? Right? And so there's some ways where you can go too far with this. There's a version called the Cotton Patch version, and it talks about Paul's letter to Washington. Right? So it took the letter to the Romans and kind of updated it and made it Paul's letter to Washington. Well, you're going too far with that. Right? Just because Rome was the capital of the empire at the time doesn't mean that you should necessarily put Washington in it, right? So you can go too extreme, and you can be too wooden where it's incomprehensible. But essentially, there are a couple of areas where translators have some very difficult choices that they have to make, which can make some difficulties for us today. In fact, there's a couple areas specifically that become problematic. First is the issue of weights, measures, and money. In many respects, the words cubit, homer, especially in the Old Testament, a lot of those are simply transliterations of Hebrew words, right? And so the cubit is cubit in Hebrew, right? And so you're finding English letters for those Hebrew letters, and the equivalents in sound. So do you transliterate like that, and so you got cubits? Or do you find an English equivalent? And so you say, okay, well, 1 cubit was about, the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, so about 18 inches. So you convert everything. So instead of saying that the arc was, 300 cubits by 50 cubits by however many other cubits, I forget off the top of my head. Right? Do you put that in feet, right? 450 feet, about 75 feet, right? And so, which do you go with? Right? So, some cases, like the dynamic equivalent, is going to put it in feet. Right? And so the arc is so many feet by so many feet by so many feet. The literal is going to keep it in cubits. What do you do about money? Right? Feet and cubits, right, or meters, they're going to probably, feet and meters are probably going to stay the same. But what do you do about money? Because money isn't always going to stay the same, right? The value of $1 is different today than it was, yesterday in some respects, right? When you look at foreign currency, and then especially if you go historically, right, the purchasing power of $1 changes. So do you try to do it in equivalency of an exact equivalency, or do you try to do, look to the future? So, for example, the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18. Let's look at Matthew 18. Jesus tells a parable in Matthew 18 of a servant who owes his master, his king, a huge amount of money. Somebody would read, actually I'll get two readers. Somebody read 21 through 28, and then somebody else 29 through 35. Matthew 18, 21 through 28, and then 29 through 35.
Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but 70 times 7. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he had begun to settle them, the one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. But since he did not have the means to repay his Lord, commanded him to be sold along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment to be made. So the slave fell on the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything. And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him of the debt. But that slave went out and found his fellow slave who owed him 100 denarii, and he seized him and began to choke him, saying, Pay back what you owe.
Yes, and if somebody pick up at 29 and finish the chapter.
So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I have pity on you? And his master was angry, delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him. So my heavenly Father also will do to you if each of you from his heart does not forgive his brother his trespasses.
Okay, there's a couple issues here with translation in this passage. Now, but despite the issues of translation, the passage itself is pretty clear. Right? You can understand the point that Jesus is making, no matter what translation you're using. It has to do with forgiving someone else, with the idea, of course, that you have been forgiven of something much greater than what somebody can do to you. Right? So the meaning of the passage is clear. But there's some challenges that arise in translating. Right? So if a publishing house or a group is creating a translation, they have this difficulty. So, for example, the first one is in verse 22. How many times did Jesus say to forgive?
70 times.
70 times 7. Is that what you have in your text? Anybody have a number other than 70 times 7?
77.
77. Oh, wait, which is it? 77 times or 70 times 7, which is what, 490 times? We're not entirely sure, right? Because it's one of those issues where here's this number, and in English we're not sure, should it be 70 times 7 or should it be 77 times? Now, does it matter in one sense? No, because the point isn't taking off how many times your fellow Christian comes to you, right, and says, okay, you've hit 77, I'm not going to forgive you, or if you hit 490, I'm not going to forgive you. Right? So either way, Jesus is trying to say, you always forgive. The question is, what's the number that he uses in trying to say it? Well, the number is in Greek. Let me look here quickly and say the number in Greek is something I can't pronounce. Right. Abdomenikonikakis eta. Alright. So what does that mean? Does that mean 77 times, or does it mean 70 times 7? We don't know, but that's not the point. But it is just so we can get the meaning. But as a translator, you're trying to figure this out, and so that's why you have differences in some translations saying 77 times and others saying 70 times 7. So you have that issue. The second issue has to do with the amounts of money owed by these two slaves. In a literal translation, you're going to find, or predominantly literal translation, you're going to find that the first servant owed 10,000 talents, and the second servant owed 100 denarii. Now, can anybody give me change for a dollar in denarii? Most of us don't use denarii accounting. Now, we might have a footnote, right? If we have a study Bible, or we have a footnote in our translation, which would tell us the value of a denarius or a talent. A denarius was worth about 1 day's wage for a common laborer, and a talent was, well, sometimes you'll see 10, sometimes you'll see 15, sometimes you'll see 20 years worth of labor. Right? And so, again, the point is clear. The second servant owed the first servant a small amount of money. The first servant owed the large amount of money. But you're trying to translate it here. Do you translate it literally? 10,000 talents, 100 denarii. Knowing that people don't use talents and denarii. Or do you try to put it in millions of dollars and just a few dollars, as some translations do? Or do you do it, the NIV puts it as 10,000 bags of gold and 100 silver coins. Again, the point is clear, right? Small versus big. But if you put it as $1 million and a few dollars, the point's conveyed, but is that accurate enough? Because let's say as a common laborer you make $25,000 a year. And so you multiply that by 20 years. That's about, what are we looking at? 400,000, 500,000, 4 million? Let me check. All right, you make $25,000 a year. That's 20 years. All right, $500,000. Versus, let's say you make minimum wage is $7. Let's just say you make $56 a day. All right, so $5,600 versus $500,000. Or do you do it different, right? And so, in a couple of years, that's going to be different. And so your translation is going to be outdated if you put it in exact equivalence as it is right now. And that wasn't even right. That's 500,000 times 10,000. So, we're talking 5 billion. So again, the issue is the meaning's clear. The question is, where do you put the amount? Putting it bags of gold, though, is one way to do it, where you kind of, the other thing, of course, is that the talent was a weight. So do you take the weight of 10,000 talents and use that as opposed, right? So there's all sorts of issues. We're just trying to figure out how do you take this sum of money and put it in such a way in English where it's going to make sense.